All right, guys, we are back at our glorious studios with our favorite guest, Joe Brady. And we wanted to spend some time today and going over a little bit of information on how folks can help themselves or know someone who may have had COVID within the last wave or just maybe still recuperating from it. And Joe, we were just kind of briefly talking about it. Go ahead and give us some insight on somebody who may have just had COVID and is wanting to help themselves or help their lungs kind of get back to a good average feel and functionality.
First thing in terms of what you just said right there is to know that it's going to take a little time. I've seen the MRIs of COVID patients as much as 4 months after they stop showing any symptoms, and the damage to their lungs is still quite extensive. And so, like COPD, it's going to take a while for those lungs to get back any kind of function. And so people need to be patient. And when it comes to developing any kind of an exercise regime, as we were talking about, one of the things the Chinese have found really important with recovery from COVID is they call it the 80% rule. What it is normally physical activity is great no matter what's going on with your body. But COVID's kind of an exception, in that if people exert themselves to their limit, they go out and they exercise too much, they're exhausted for a week afterward. And so the recovery time is dramatically longer. And so each time they do that, they end up back in bed. And so better to use what the Chinese call the 80% rule is if you know you're going to start having trouble breathing, walking, half a mile, is take about 20% off of that and stop short of that half a mile. If that means sitting down on a park bench and taking a break and letting your breathing catch up to you, then do that. Again, the physical activity is the easiest way to encourage your entire body. There's a whole long line from the time you suck air into your lungs to the time that it gets to your muscles. And physical activity is the only way to exercise that whole process metabolically. But again, with COVID and with COPD patients, if you do too much, you'll get yourself to a point where the whole system just gets exhausted, and they can be exhausted for days afterward. So biggest thing is make a note of how much physical activity you can get before you start sucking air.
What is something someone can do at home while they're recuperating, and then maybe they're at the end of the cycle of feeling they're not symptomatic anymore? They're just kind of getting past that stage.
And you have to look at it as a process. And so, for example, people don't realize this, but if you've got somebody who's completely bedridden, they can as much as double their cardiovascular fitness just by sitting up once in a while. Sitting requires twice as much strength of your heart to pump blood up to your head sitting as it does laying down. And so even starting with something that simple, in Chinese hospitals, they'll have them start doing Tai Chi sitting up in their bed and just kind of going through the movements, just to begin to get used to the idea of movement and physical activity, but without, like we talked about, exerting themselves so much that they're exhausted for days afterward. If you got somebody who's used to sitting for a while and they're comfortable with that and their oxygen stays good, then it takes, again, twice as much cardiovascular fitness to stand as it does sitting. People don't realize that counts as physical activity. And for some people, especially if they're recovering from a bad bout in the hospital, that's enough to get the process going. In fact, in most hospitals these days, as long as their physical condition permits, the nurses will try to get you up standing as quickly as possible. And then they'll take you with your oxygen tank in one hand and your IV thing in the other hand and have you walk up and down the hall a little bit. When you got people recovering at home, just putzing around the house begins to get the physiology going to where your body gets used to taking the air from what you breathe and getting it all the way out to your muscles where it's going to be used.
So you bring up something very interesting. I think one of the things that I've been really frustrated about, like many people, is no one has a set protocol or any suggestions of what to do to help someone who has COVID and has to sit it out at home. So if, let's just say your neighbor has COVID, they're at home, their doctor said, hey, take some Tylenol or anything if your fever goes up. What are some basic exercises that can help for their lungs or just putzing around the house? Give us an example of what some of our users can do if this happens to them.
The chi breathing exercises are a great place to start that we've talked about in the past. No matter how sick you are, unless you're on a ventilator, you can breathe. And especially if somebody's really sick in the hospital, I mean, it's a soul-crushing experience if you've ever been in an intensive care unit. And people feel completely helpless in the face of everything going on. And one thing they know in psychology is the human brain hates to feel helplessness. It likes to have some sense of control. So even sitting there in the hospital, it's possible for people to do some breathing exercises. There's a lot of things in your life you can't control, and there's a lot of things you can't control when you're ill, and especially if you're in the hospital. But your breathing, you can control. And the idea is to sit and just focus on your breathing. The kids got me an Apple Watch for Christmas, and it's got this cool little thing that's got a little visual display as you breathe in and breathe out. And all those little toys, I mean, they're nothing more than toys, but they're important because it helps keep your attention focused on that sort of thing. I've got on my phone, we've talked about it, I've got an app that does a little gong every 10 seconds, every 15 seconds.
I downloaded it after you told me.
So that you can practice the breathing. And there's very few guarantees in life, Konstantin, but here's a guarantee. No matter how sick you're feeling, no matter how poorly, how tired you're feeling, 15 minutes of some chi breathing and focusing on your breathing, and you will feel better at the end. You may not be cured, but you will feel better than when you started. And it's something that you have control over. In Chinese medicine, which is my background, the Chinese really believe that people should be an active participant in their own healing rather than simply a victim of their disease. And this is especially true when you talk about the whole concept of salutogenesis, how you get healthy, how you get from where you're sick to where you're feeling strong and healthy. That whole process requires that you feel some sense of control of the situation. That helplessness only is debilitating psychologically and then debilitating physically. So to take control of the little things that you do have control over. A great game to play, and we're talking about one of the things that people can do while they're home, is you should certainly have yourself a pulse oximeter to be able to measure your own oxygen. Again, it's nice with the Apple Watch the kids got me in that it's got a pulse oximeter built in, and it keeps track of my oxygen in the background, which is handy because I noticed with one of the finger ones, the more stressed out I am about what my oxygen is going to be, the worse my oxygen is. Yeah. And by keeping track of it in the background that way, it's tracking it during times that I'm not thinking about it. And actually, that was very encouraging because it turned out my oxygen was doing pretty damn good when I wasn't thinking about it. Yeah. And normally I would only check it when I wasn't feeling good and see what it was. And of course, then it's going to be down.
That white coat theory that they say, right?
Or that little yellow and black oximeter syndrome.
Yeah.
But that can make a big difference, both in encouraging people to be more active if they check their oxygen on a regular basis, and then everything that you can do in terms of trying to get healthier. If you've got an opportunity where you're sick like that, that's actually not entirely a bad thing. And so one saying in China now is if you catch COVID 3 times, then you too will have enough knowledge to become a Chinese doctor. Because if you've been able to recover from that in any way, shape, or form, you'll learn more about your diet and how quickly things that you normally wouldn't think of as part of it. If somebody's having trouble with their oxygen for a level, for example, you wouldn't think of this, but if you drink a carbonated beverage, all the carbonation is carbon dioxide. And you're little by little increasing the carbon dioxide in your blood with those carbonated beverages. Again, when your lungs are healthy, you're not going to notice that effect. But when somebody's oxygen is hovering around 90, and then you drink that Diet Coke and your oxygen drops to 85, you can see the difference right there in front of you. So it's a great opportunity to go ahead and begin to think about taking care of your health in the long run and use it to your advantage rather than using it as I'm a victim of COVID, use it as a wake-up call, because we'll all do those things that we know are not healthy for us. And rather than waiting for it to catch up to you and bite you on the butt, is to go ahead and get on top of it. This is a perfect opportunity to do just that.
So another thing that I had read about, I don't know if you're familiar with Professor Dr. Huberman.
I've heard the name.
Yeah, so he has a lot of guests on in his podcast, one of my favorite podcasts, but he had a guest on who was a specialist on breathing, and he talked about box breathing. So where you do a 4 or 5 second inhale, you hold it for 4 seconds, then you exhale for 4 seconds, and then you basically exhaled for 4 seconds. And one of the things that he was mentioning in this podcast was that is something that not only does he recommend for someone who had just recently had COVID, which Dr. Huberman just did and came on the podcast with them, but he also mentioned it's a great thing to do when you are having a stressful day or losing focus, or you're exerting yourself a lot. So that's a box breathing one, is one that I've actually implemented in my daily routine a couple times a day, where I think, if I'm hearing you correctly, just trying to bring focus and more oxygen to yourself and kind of calm yourself, that helps. Now, another thing that I wanted to ask you, so, someone had COVID, they're finally over it. In your experience, what do you think with somebody properly taking care of their body while having and after having it, what are some things they can do, 2-3 weeks, 1 month after, and how can they self-measure that they're getting better or getting back to their normal levels?
Probably the most accurate way of measuring it is with your long-term physical activity. And this is true. Right now, it's one of the top ways here in Colorado for ranchers to measure the health of their cattle. If you got 50,000 head of cattle out on the range, how do you keep track of the health of all of them? Well, now they put accelerometers on them, just like you've got in your phone that tracks your steps each day. And what they find is there's a direct relationship. When that animal's not doing so good, they move less, until they move so little that they know they need to send a vet out there and find that cow and find out what's wrong. When they're healthy, as they get healthy, their activity begins to increase. Yeah. And so that's one of the easiest ways. If you had to take one measure to measure everything going on in your body, that long-term physical activity makes a difference. And it doesn't have to be, organized, structured fitness class. Right. You can see the difference just in the number of steps that you take. When someone's feeling good and their energy is good and they're feeling healthy, they go more places during the day. They do more things. They go to that church group. They go to that volunteer activity. When they're not feeling as well, those are the things that begin to wind down. And it's sort of like a pendulum. The more energy you put into the pendulum, the bigger its swing is, the healthier it is. As that energy begins to wane and it drops down, sooner or later, it's just going to stop moving. In order to keep it moving, you got to add a little bit of energy and poke that pendulum once in a while. And same thing with our physiology. Sometimes you got to poke it. Sometimes you got to get a kick in the butt. Yeah. Which with COVID, that's a swift kick in the butt. Yeah. It's time to get up and start doing stuff. And again, the only caveat I would add there is with recovery from COVID or COPD is that 80% rule. Like Woody Guthrie once said, take it easy, but take it. And it's not often these days I get to quote Woody Guthrie. So there you go.
So the couple of days ago, we were watching Super Size Me. If you've ever seen that one. Yeah, there you go. So he has to follow this experiment. For many folks who haven't seen it, he eats the McDonald's diet 3 times a day for a set amount of days. And he has to follow the average American's exercise routine. And in the documentary, they talk about the average American takes between 3,500 and 4,000 steps a day. And so they literally gave him a pedometer. This is an older movie. They didn't have fancy smartphones and watches. And he basically realized, well, just him walking from his apartment to the McDonald's would be half of his steps that he was allowed to take, which is about 1,700 steps. So Another thing that I want to correlate this with is something you mentioned, that if we're only doing 4,000 steps a day, I think science is saying there's this 10,000 steps is this gold rule.
Good
right?
topic.
Yeah.
They made that up.
Yeah. It's this gold rule. But what they're really saying is you really want to try and get somewhere between 6,500 to 10,000 steps, right? If it's realistic.
I would turn that on its head a little bit. The 10,000 steps is interesting. If you trace that back, there never was a study that showed that 10,000 steps made you healthy. What it was is in the early 1990s, there was a Japanese researcher that wrote a letter to the editor of one of the journals saying, what if we got people doing 10,000 steps a day, would they be healthier? And for some God only knows reason, that stuck. We talk about follow the science. There was no science behind that. The reality is, like we were talking about, if you got somebody who's bedridden, taking a few steps is a big step in the right direction. And so that's why if you get an Apple Watch, one of the more sophisticated ones, is they tell you don't even pay attention to it for the first 18 days. It takes 18 days for the artificial intelligence in the watch and in the phone to figure out what your pattern is. That's what matters. If you're getting 1,000 steps a day, you will do better if you get 1,050. That 50 extra steps makes a difference.
Incrementally increases.
And if you get, you get that 1,150 steps a day, and on one of these days you get to 2,000, it's going to feel good. But if every time you're thinking about, I'm only getting 2,000 steps a day, I'm supposed to get 10,000, that leads to that feeling of helplessness that we talked about. That's not good. You start where you are. And again, if you're getting 2,000 steps a day, a recovering COVID patient or somebody with severe COPD, that's a lot of steps for them in a day.
Yeah.
Adding 100 steps here or 50 steps there, that's where you get healthier.
Yep.
What they're finding, particularly with COVID, is if you go for the whole 10,000 and you get yourself exhausted, you're going to be exhausted for a week
Sure.
after that. Better to take it little by little by little and do it in a way that's enjoyable. We're coming up on springtime here in a few weeks, and the weather will be more and more amenable to people getting outside and having some fun with it. And really, for long-term compliance and healthy, that's more important than how many steps you're taking. That's why, again, if you got a smartphone, carry it with you. It'll keep track of the steps in the background so that you don't have to focus on that. You can focus on having fun.
Yeah. And pedometers, if you folks get a pedometer at Walmart, you get a pedometer at Walgreens.
For a couple bucks.
Yeah, they're under $10. They're very cheap. And for folks who do have a smartphone, some of them don't realize your smartphone will track it. And if you have a chance, you can get a Fitbit, an Apple Watch. A lot of these tools will help you stay fit and stay active. And this is really what we're trying to gear towards people. The winter and the cold months are the hardest months of the year to do that. And that's something that we're trying to help. So, Joe, give us your last and most important tip. It's the winter time. How do you want someone, or how would you recommend someone to stay active? Just one simple thing they can do from home that they don't even have to go outside.
Clean out that closet you've been meaning to clean out for so long.
Early spring cleaning.
Early spring cleaning. It's important for Chinese New Year. If you want to bring in good luck into your life, you want to clean out the old clutter. And we've just gotten off of a big snowstorm here in Colorado, and so I had to do a lot of counseling with my patients. Stop complaining about the fact that you can't walk around the block. You can still be active in the house. Just go ahead and do it. And everybody's got that closet that they know they've been meaning to clean out for the longest time. Now's the time to do it.
And to end on this note, I always go to the gym after work, do high interval exercising, and I come home, I get my fancy watch out and I show it to my wife. I'm like, 11,000 steps. And then she shows me her watch. And her watch has got 20,000 steps. And I'm like, how in the heck did you get 20,000 steps in the house during the day? And so it proves to show you.
My wife's got a beat. And she was recharging her phone one morning. I get up. She's sound asleep on the bed. I look at her phone, and she's already got 350 steps. How do you get 350 steps while you're asleep?
Well, Joe, thank you so much for getting on this topic. I think this is one that we've been trying to kind of perfect time to get it out to folks. And always nice to have your input on it.